All right, Brooke, how you doing?
All righty, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Appreciate everyone's patience. Just trying to set things up. So as some of you know already, I am on site in Texas Southern or at Texas Southern University in HBCU, one of the largest in the nations. And this is located in Houston, Texas. And so I was just in the next room, welcoming everyone, make sure everything is set up. And since I'm not there, I hope all of you can hear me. You saw me just 3 minutes ago. But one thing we're really excited about is, I am on site here in Texas Southern University in Houston. We actually have people in Dallas with Southern Methodist University. And of course, Richmond Isobor is over there. So Rich, how you doing? What we're excited about is that right here online, we have Bruke Kifle from Microsoft. He is an AI product manager. He's going to give an online talk. And after that, each location has their own on-site speaker. We have Dr. Rajdeep Golecha from WorldData.ai here in Houston, and Samar Khan, who is a senior manager at Capgemini. So obviously, our focus here for now is the online talk. Brooke, you're joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, I believe.
Correct.
Of course, starting off, we're here in sunny Texas. How's the weather for you?
I was actually outside this morning. It's not too bad. Fortunately, It was a pretty nice sunny day.
That's great. That's great. And for you, you're in. Oh, sorry. Yeah, everyone can play the video now.
Okay, because nothing has been moving, so people were wondering whether it's working.
Oh, okay. Yeah, just play the video. It should start now, and
Just
people
play
can
the
type.
video?
Huh?
Just click on play the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they can type questions in the top right.
All right, okay, great.
All right. So yeah, for you being in Cambridge, a lot of us are aware, being in the Boston area in Cambridge, you have a lot of major tech universities and all that. People can see from your LinkedIn, you went to MIT and all that. Like I said just now, AI product manager. But behind all of that, go ahead and tell everyone, who are you as a person? Just a quick intro, which we'll jump into the questions I told you earlier, but just quick intro, and then we can start with your slideshow, and then just quick intro.
Yeah. Again, thanks so much for having me, Scotty. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. So by way of quick introductions, my name is Bruke Kifle. As Scotty said, I'm currently calling in from not so sunny and warm Cambridge, Massachusetts. So a little background about myself. I was born in Ethiopia, moved to the States. I was raised here in Virginia. And growing up, always had an interest in tech, and was fortunate enough to attend MIT, and currently work as a product manager at Microsoft, where I really get a chance to explore some very interesting, challenging problems that are impacting millions and billions of users. So very excited to share some interesting insights, but looking forward to the upcoming hour with you all.
All right. Yeah, thanks a lot. And so everyone, you can see responsible development of AI that ties in with the Microsoft product that a lot of people will be using for our hackathon DATAnalyze called Responsible AI. So Brooke, go ahead and take it away. Thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Super excited to be here with you all today to chat on a topic of great importance, and one that I am personally very passionate about, which is the responsible development of AI. So just to provide some framing, what are the goals for this next 20-30 minute session? Responsible AI is a very interesting, very up and coming recent topic of discussion. So in 30 minutes, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive overview of how to achieve responsible AI. However, my promise to you is that, as aspiring engineers, product managers, entrepreneurs, technologists, you'll be able to walk away from this session with the self-awareness and the foundation to ensure that, you're building technology that's inclusive and it benefits everyone within our society, irrespective of race, gender, background, so on and so forth. So with that, I will go ahead and get started. So I'm sure you're wondering, who is this guy and why is he talking to us? So I'll just start off again by way of quick introductions. My name is Bruke Kifle. My personal story actually starts on the other side of the globe. I was born in Ethiopia and immigrated to the US, where I grew up in Virginia. So growing up in the US, with very close roots to my Ethiopian origins, I was very interested in the potential for technology to solve a lot of modern day challenges in healthcare and agriculture. The applications are far and wide. Grew up attending public schools and ultimately was able to attend MIT, where I was fortunate enough to study alongside some of the brightest minds and studied computer science and management during my time there. So currently I work as a product manager at Microsoft, where I get to work with a very great team on finding product applications of some of the recent developments of deep learning and AI. So outside of work, I do have personal passions and interests. As Scotty mentioned, we are all humans at the end of the day. So on a personal level, some of the things that I'm passionate about are applications of technology for development. So how can you target low resource settings and environments and apply technology in a way that improves the quality of life for people. Another area of interest professionally for me is responsible AI, which is what this talk will cover. There's also an important notion of diversity and inclusion that ties into all of that. So D&I in higher ed, D&I in tech, all important aspects of building technology by people, for people in an inclusive manner. And then of course, I do enjoy working out, playing basketball. I actually picked up painting over the pandemic, so I've been making some pretty nice art pieces. And I like to consider myself somewhat of an amateur chef. I do enjoy dabbling in the kitchen a bit. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started with the actual content for today. Now I want to start off with a thought exercise for all of you. So I'm going to set up the scenario. Now imagine you're in this car, a self-driving car to be exact, going down the road at 60 miles per hour. Now at a distance, you see a huge concrete wall, and suddenly you notice that your brakes don't work. Now, if you don't do anything, unfortunately, you will crash into the wall and not survive. However, you notice that you can intervene, swerving left, driving into that very innocent and cute puppy, and stopping the car, sparing your life, but doing so at the expense of the puppy. So in that moment, I ask you, how should the technology behave? Should the technology go straight? Should it swerve left, killing the puppy and potentially saving you? Or, is there potentially some other scenario? So I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about what the proposed behavior of the technology should be in that situation. Now, those of you who are familiar or who may have taken a philosophy or ethics course may, find some relationships with the trolley car problem. Now, in this scenario, there's three broad categories of decisions. There are those who argue that the car should go straight. I'm sure a majority or a minority may have been in that position. And the arguments there are that, it's not ethical for us to be actively intervening, because then we are responsible for the death of the puppy. People also argue that the car should be programmed to prioritize and protect the life of those in the surrounding area, even if that's at the expense of the passenger in the car. Now, on the contrary, there's a subset of people who traditionally argue that you should swerve left. The argument here is that the life of a human being is more important than the life of an animal. There are also people who will note that the puppy was actually jaywalking. So if you look at the crosswalk sign, the puppy should not have been crosswalking, and so for that reason, it's on them if they die. And then there are those who argue that the car should be programmed to prioritize and protect the life of the occupant. And then for those who are in the third category, these are idealists who think of some very crazy, unrealistic solution, like the car should levitate and save all lives. But unfortunately, that's not a realistic proposal. Now, what we just explored here, I said is a thought exercise, but is actually no longer a thought exercise. So autonomous vehicles are on the road today, and the ethical decisions that are being made when designing these kinds of systems is not as simple or ideal as the one that I just walked through. So you can consider this scenario where maybe now you have to take into account the personal utility and value of the individual. So you think about their careers, how much impact they can have on society. So in that case, do you value a doctor over, an individual who maybe is not working a professional job? And then you can think of this scenario where maybe there are multiple puppies and multiple lives at hand, or different genders, or different age groups, or different population breakdowns. So the scenarios go on and on. So the main thing here is that self-driving cars are on the road today, and practitioners, so you think of engineers, managers, data scientists, ML engineers, those who are actually designing these systems are forced to think about and define what the car should be trained to do in these kinds of scenarios. So who should be determining the behavior? Whose ethical principles are they reflecting? I'm sure within the rooms that you guys are all in, people have different ideas. So how are we incorporating some of the cultural or religious or geopolitical considerations? So once you begin to think about some of these, very important considerations, then you're working towards developing some element of a responsible AI. So for those of you who are interested, this is actually part of a broader experiment that was conducted in 2014 by researchers at the MIT Media Lab called Moral Machines. And essentially what they seek to do here is try to crowdsource human perspectives on moral decisions that machines will have to make or are making. So why is all of this important? Why did I walk through this example? Well, AI, artificial intelligence, is really transforming the fourth industrial revolution. So you think about this transformation really being enabled by two main things. So we've seen a lot of improvements in computing technologies with GPUs, TPUs, FPGAs, and all of that has been compared with large amounts of data. So when you combine those things, you're able to develop AI that can solve critical problems across a range of domains. So you think of healthcare, legal, education. AI is practically everywhere today. And we can specifically see this evidenced by the large investments that big companies are making in AI-related research, AI-related development. So you see some of the leading companies here with patents. You see big investments in the form of actual investments, but also acquisitions, as well as a lot of up-and-coming startups. So it's not just the big guys that are making these investments, but also up-and-coming startups that are using AI to transform the way industries currently work. So in vision and auto and cybersecurity, the list goes on. So, I just highlighted that there's great potential that comes with AI, but with great power comes great responsibility. So I want to share a fact that some of you may or may not have known. And this fact is that no women were actually on the teams that built the first crash test dummies for cars in the 70s. No women were on the team. So as a result, the dummies that were used to test the car safety were built according to the shape and the size and the stature of your average European male. So guess what? Surprise, in 2019, a study found that the odds of being seriously injured for a female occupant in a front crash were 73% higher than for a male occupant. So what exactly is the takeaway here? The takeaway is that bias in technology is not new. And unfortunately, this is a pretty meaningful quote here. If we can't learn from the past, then we are condemned to repeat it. And most likely now with AI, with a higher degree of consequence. So, hopefully this has provided some of the context on why responsibly developing AI and technology is important. And it's important to realize that this isn't just a user-centered design or user-in-the-loop approach. This requires a systems level perspective. So, clearly in the crash test dummy, they were thinking about a user, they just weren't thinking about an inclusive or diverse user base. So we'll touch on some of the responsible AI principles that will help you think about some of these things. So like we said, learning from the past is important. So I would like to highlight some case studies where AI technology has gone left. And hopefully by getting some understanding of these cases, you can learn to identify future scenarios where maybe there might be potential harms. So a 2018 study from the MIT Media Lab actually showed that commercial face recognition, so this is technology that's being used to identify faces, it might be your age, your emotion. This can be used in criminal justice, in law enforcement. Applications are very wide. But the study found that these technologies were actually biased against women and darker skinned individuals. So you can see the accuracy is much higher for lighter males, where you have almost 100% accuracy, whereas darker females are at a whopping 68% accuracy. So you can think about what consequences this has when you consider that this is being used in healthcare, this is being used in law enforcement. We also have interesting cases where a chatbot, I'm not sure if any of you were familiar with Tay, was released by Microsoft, and it ultimately experienced quality degradation, and then ultimately became a very racist chatbot. So this was a case where the technology was learning as it was being used. So it was taking in new data, and it was actively modifying the actual AI that was powering the chatbot. And as a result, the data that was coming in led the technology to become racist in this particular case. We also see interesting cases with social media. So, with Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, we saw issues with privacy and targeted advertisement, and how that ultimately tipped the political election. So you can think about the serious repercussions that this has on society and political stability. In the legal domain, there are actual AI tools that are being used for sentencing, and it has shown very disproportionate biases against people of color. So in this particular example, you can see a white male with much higher prior offenses being deemed lower risk. So if you look at the image on the right, then African-American male with fewer prior offenses who is deemed higher risk. So this reflects institutional biases that already exist, because we're using data to train models to make these decisions. But if the data is biased, then of course, the decision-making in that system is also biased. We talked about self-driving cars and concerns around safety. So you have a self-driving car that killed a person. Is that okay? And what is the level of tolerance that we have for mistakes? Financial sector, you have AI being used to make decisions on who gets a loan, who can get a loan to buy a house or buy a car. And there are cases where disproportionately people of color are being denied loans because of biases in the decision-making system. You have translation services that are implicitly associating more dominant roles with the male gender, and more nurses, roles like nurse with a feminine. So even daily products have embedded biases. And this doesn't even touch on some of the business impacts that are resulting from robotics and AI. So you think about how many jobs are being automated away because of technology. So no more cashiers, no more people in factory lines. So what is the impact on those people? How do they now find a job, and what are their options moving forward? But it's not just automating away jobs, it's also the jobs that are available that are being gatekept by AI. So you had an AI tool that was screening resumes that was actually scrapped by Amazon because it was biased against women. So it was trained on a bunch of resumes that were dominantly male, and so for that reason, it was biasing against women. And then lastly, there are concerns around privacy. So, face recognition is being used in China, and for very valuable things like contact tracing, especially in the COVID pandemic. But there are concerns around, do we forego privacy and human rights over your data for broader benefits to society at large? So these are just some examples, but hopefully they're broad enough to illustrate some of the widespread impacts that AI can have. Most of the time really good, but also some of the concerning cases where there are detrimental impacts to individuals and society at large. So what can you do? So we talked about all these harms, but how can you actually work towards mitigating some of these consequences? And how can you, sort of have the framework to think about these issues? To do so, it's important to actually start off by identifying the different types of data that can exist in technology. So in the literature, these are broadly defined in three main categories. So you have pre-existing bias, which is, bias that has its roots in, society and social institutions, and it reflects the, society or organization that's actually determining the product and the requirements. So the prime example here that we talked about earlier is the sentencing tool. You're using existing data to help with sentencing, but for the past 50, 60, 100 or so years, if the data that's been collected on how we sentence and charge potential criminals is biasing against African Americans, then that new tool will have its roots and will have pre-existing bias. The second broad category is technical bias. So these are emerging as a result of constraints in the actual technology. So a good example here is the self-driving cars. So for example, in a self-driving cars, if you have limitations on the number of cameras or sensors you can have, that might impair the judgment due to some of these technical limitations. And then lastly, you have emergent bias. So this is probably the scariest, but also the one that's most difficult to foresee, which is you deploy some kind of product into the world, people use it, and then as a result of that engagement, the model or the actual product begins to go bad. So a perfect example here is the chatbot that we described. This was released for the purposes of having good, valuable, addition to people. People started engaging with it in very bad ways, and that became data that was further improving the product, but in this case, led the product to become more racist. So it's important to have some context on what are the different kinds of biases you can have in AI. Now, keeping in mind these biases, how do they have an impact on individuals, on organizations, and on society? Now, there's a wonderful resource, a report that was done by McKinsey that highlights at each level these sensitive uses. So what are the impacts that it has, that AI technology has on people's lives as a result of that decision-making system? So at the individual level, you can think about, physical harms and safety. So, we talked about self-driving cars, or it can be in the healthcare domain. How does the technology itself actually pose some kind of risk to the financial safety of the individual? We've also talked about, for example, in the legal or financial sector, how does this impact financial health, equity and fair treatment, so on and so forth. And then of course, privacy with some of the things around face recognition, contact tracing, so on and so forth. So interesting sensitive use cases at the individual level. At the organizational level, AI is being used to automate a lot of tasks, financials, algorithmic trading. How does that ultimately affect financial performance? You think about AI tools that are being used for recruiting. How does that have an effect on reputational integrity or non-financial performance, as well as some of the legal and compliance stuff? At a societal level, we talked about Cambridge Analytica, privacy, targeted advertisement. How does technology like social media that leverages AI for these kinds of targeted advertisement affect national security or have an overall impact on the stability of one country's political system or economic system? And then from a national security point of view, you can think about AI-powered technologies such as advanced weaponry, drones that are leveraging some of the greatest technology, in AI, but how is that redefining the way we think about national security? So the biases we've defined and how they play a role in these sensitive uses is a great framework for you to have whenever you're, building products, hacking on new projects, to think about, just to make sure that there's no serious consequences or impacts on people at different stages. So some of the principles that you can keep in mind and hopefully implement, there are over 300, but this list is meant to capture some of the most important value-based principles. So, thinking about ethics, how do you deal with what's right and wrong? How do you ensure whose ethical principles are being reflected? So if you go to different parts of the world, the ethical principles or value principles are very different in one part of the world than they are in another. So, with self-driving cars, what kind of ethical decisions are being made and whose ethical principles are they reflecting? Fairness, this is probably one of the most commonly and widely discussed. How do you treat different subpopulations, and what is the subsequent impact of those fairness trade-offs. So, do you equalize the number of false positives? Do you equalize error rates? Do you equalize, many different ways to define what it means to be fair? So thinking about how do you define a standard on what a fair AI system is, and how do you make that fair assessment? Inclusiveness, this is on two aspects. This is both in the design of the technology as well as the output. So we discussed the crash test dummies where the team that made the technology wasn't inclusive because clearly it lacked females, but also the product itself, when it went out into the public, into the society, was not inclusive because it was not considering the different statures or body sizes of kids and women. Transparency and explainability, usually we think about machine learning or AI as a black box. You put in some question and then a result comes out. So how do you actually understand and justify why a decision was made? Why was a certain individual marked high risk? Why was a certain individual denied a loan? So being able to provide some transparency and explainability on why a decision was made. Accountability is also an interesting principle, or an important principle. Who is responsible for the actions of an AI? So a self-driving car, you get into a car accident, you identify who the individual driving the car was. But with a self-driving car, who is responsible? Is it the company? Is it the data scientist? Is it the engineer? Is it the manager? So how do you define some accountability when there's no actual individual? And then reliability and safety is, how do you create a system that's robust? We talked about the chatbot that went out and learned and accidentally became racist. So how do you create a reliable, robust system? And then from the safety piece, how do you ensure that that technology is safe for people in the surrounding? And then lastly, privacy and security. Most of you may know of GDPR, which was the General Data Protection Regulation, which is a framework of guidelines for individuals in the EU. But how do you ensure that you're preserving people's data and privacy? So we talked about biases, we talked about sensitive uses, and I'm wrapping up, so stay here with me. But now, how can you actually apply these in the context of developing an AI product or an AI technology or a new AI innovation? So to do that, it's important to think about AI development in sort of this pipeline, which is from concept exploration to the actual deployment. So to start off, you have the design stage, where you're actually thinking about the problem that you're trying to solve. And the main thing here is you really want to demonstrate the ability to justify why you need AI. Not all problems require an AI-driven sort of technology or feature, but it's important to be able to identify, should this problem actually be approached as an ML task? And if I do, what are some of the implications? So at an individual level, organizational level, societal level. And then how do you think about some of the principles that we discussed? So fairness, transparency, explainability, so on and so forth. The next stage is actually collecting the data to train your model. So I'm sure you guys have worked with a lot of data over the course of this hackathon. Identify, is data available? And if so, is it representative of the real world? So we talked about the face recognition technology being biased against women and darker skinned individuals. That was because the training set that was used to train the model didn't represent those subset of individuals. And when they actually retrained a lot of those models with more representative data sets, they saw a lot of improvement. So how are you making sure that your data set is representative of the real world? And what are some of the limitations in your data, and how can that influence the model's behavior? Up next, you actually have the responsibility of training and developing your model. And here you want to ensure that the model is explainable. It makes a decision, but it's done so in a way that you can justify it. And then, you also want to define whatever your performance metrics are: accuracy, precision, recall. In addition to that, how do you measure things like fairness, transparency, accountability? Do you have metrics in place to actually measure those things? And what will you do to ensure trade-offs are made? Usually fairness can be at the expense of overall model accuracy. So what kind of trade-offs are you making there? And then once you deploy your system and it's out into the public and now people are using it, job's not done. job is still not done. So during this stage, you need to think about how, the system is interacting with people. You got to monitor and ensure that the model and the product is actually working the way it's intended, so that, you don't have cases like the chatbot where it was out in the public and became detrimental to society. So with that, you have, an end-to-end picture from concept formulation in the design stage to the actual deployment. So there's no, hard and fast rule. It's not about use this tool, use this API, use this library, but rather you want to start, in addition to that, you want to start having an ongoing process that requires a lot of thought, a lot of awareness at each one of these stages. So ultimately, I want to leave you with sort of two main takeaways, which are what are things you can do as future leaders, as future engineers, current engineers, managers, entrepreneurs, technologists. What are things that you can do? And I think the best way to break it down is a combination of both, technical, but also tactical, strategic steps that you can take. From the technical side, we talked about how are you ensuring your data sets are representative of the real world? How are you defining the performance metrics for your product, your model? Are you stress testing your system? And then once you deploy, are you actually monitoring to make sure that it's performing in a way that is anticipated? From the more strategic, tactical side, you really want to ensure that you're establishing or working with diverse teams. This is in the form of people's subject matter expertise. So, if you're creating a tool for doctors or for healthcare, you want to make sure you have a doctor in the room. You want to make sure you have a patient in the room. You want to make sure you get the perspective of those people who actually use this technology. So subject matter expertise, background, race, gender, sexual orientation, whatever it might be, making sure that you have a representative and diverse team that's actually making those products that are being used by diverse individuals. I also encourage you to check out the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're basically this international organization that sets some standard on responsible AI values and principles. So they're a great resource for tracking some of the things we discussed today. And then you want to make sure you're considering some of the things we discussed today, which are what are the sensitive uses, what are the principles, and when you combine some of these both technical and tactical steps, then hopefully you can work towards a more responsible AI. So with that, I have one quick video to show. I think the thumbnail spoiled it. Can you see this video, Scotty?
Yeah, I can see it.
All right, let me just play it.
All right.
All right, I'll stop it there. So why did I show you that, and what was the relevance? The main takeaway here is that, as the title says here, sometimes doing things differently can lead to, very, not just innovative, but also better results. So, as the future generation of technologists and leaders, you represent new ways of thinking, new ways of problem solving, and the ability to think about existing problems in new and transformative ways. Frankly, that is what we need to solve some of the challenging problems of today and tomorrow. So I hope this session was valuable in providing some of the foundation and context. I've summarized here some of the key takeaways from today's session. A lot of important considerations and questions to ask, and now more than ever, we're seeing some of the real consequences of technology and AI, and having diverse thoughts, diverse people with new and innovative ways of thinking is what we need. So I hope you were able to walk away with some important lessons, and it was a pleasure to be here with you all today.
All right, thanks a lot, Brooke. Yeah, I just realized I was muted when I was watching the video because I was saying, "Whoa, what was he doing?" But yeah, I want to say it's something that I was kind of thinking, why didn't the other cyclists do the same thing? I mean, it occurred to me, okay, maybe they haven't trained for that trick. So they're thinking, oh, it might be dangerous if I do it. But it is one of those things that kind of makes you think, wait, you see it working. Why aren't you doing it? Sometimes you're just kind of used to what you've done before. Of course, sometimes being valid, you're just concerned about what if I mess up because I've never trained that. And so it's not necessarily you're not willing to do it. You're just concerned, hey, I might not execute well enough. So I think that's a really important thing to point out. So just real quick, we did have a question in our YouTube section from, and hopefully I'm saying this right, Aji Jewel Hake. The question is, how do you think this will affect us in the upcoming years, considering the advancement of technologies such as Meta?
I think there are, very interesting technologies. Again, Meta is looking to transform the way we interact by bringing, the metaverse and the virtual reality and making that part of our regular world. I think, again, some of the things we discussed here is that, the folks who are responsible for making these technologies need to think about short, mid, and long-term impacts of the consequences of these technologies. I'm sure creators of Facebook or Twitter did not realize how widespread and instrumental of a core technology it'll be in people's everyday lives today. You think back 10 years ago, Uber and Lyft were not really a thing, but it's provided a lot of value add. So I think technology can go both ways. And I think some of the recent promises with things like, Meta and AR and VR have a lot of potential, but there are many cases where there are unforeseen consequences that maybe we haven't even thought about. What impact will this have on mental health? What impact will this have on physical health? How important is personal interaction to upkeep to those things? So it's hard to know what the impact will be without actually seeing the impact. But I think having folks in the room who can provide different perspectives will be an important way to mitigate some of those harms.
All right. Yeah, and then for anyone who has more questions, you can type them into the chat box. We're going to go and ask Brooke some other questions first, then we'll come back to everyone else's questions. So Brooke, you mentioned earlier a little bit about yourself, born and raised in Ethiopia, moved here, grew up some more in the US and all that, like playing basketball and all that. Was there anything specific that led you to be interested in tech and analytics, or was it just something that it just always was there for you?
Yeah, I think, again, I was pretty young when I moved, but I do recount one of the biggest influences for me was, moving from, a low resource environment in Ethiopia that has, very rich resources, that has very rich natural resources and intellectual capacity, but was lacking some of the technical infrastructure that maybe we see here in the United States, made me realize that there's a lot of great potential for addressing some of the biggest issues like the education gap, or things like poverty, or things like agriculture inefficiency, with very basic technological solutions. And so again, I was very young, but as I was growing up, I had close roots to my family back home, and being able to think about some of the luxuries that we have here, in a place like the US, and, contradicting that with some of the limited resources that were available back home, really motivated me to think about, oh, okay, how can I use technology, which is one of the most efficient ways to have impact on a large number of people with very minimal resources. How can technology be used to improve, quality of life? And so I've always had a passion for maths and sciences. But ultimately, that's what really drove me to go into tech, but also specifically computer science. You write a piece of software, you deploy it, and now you have hundreds, thousands, millions of users using it at once. So I think the ability for widespread impact and reach is there. And for me, the story really started when thinking about, how can I improve quality of life around the world?
All right. Yeah, it sounds like that's a lot of what you've been doing in your own life, impacting your own life in that way, but also, that's kind of become, well, I guess not your life, but, an integral part of your life because it's your career, and you're taking time out of your Saturday to give a talk about this, which we really appreciate. But, clearly it's more than just something you do. It's clearly a passion, something that is just, I imagine it's probably something that just kind of day to day is just there, just by default.
Yep. Yep.
I guess, would you say there's ever been a time where, not necessarily in a terrible crisis way, but, conflicts between your life and tech?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. I think for me, it actually breaks down to two broad scenarios. The first is actually, the thesis of what I presented today, which is, conflicts where we see technology, which is meant to be good for society and the world, disproportionately affecting communities that I'm a part of, whether it be, in the form of, bias or racist decision-making systems for the legal sector or in healthcare, seeing cases where technology, which was supposed to be built for everyone, disproportionately affecting, the communities that I care for most, was a point of conflict. And so as a point of actually mitigating that, that is why, like you said, I am passionate about having these discussions, because nobody can help everybody, but everybody can help somebody. And so for me, taking time, to have these, conversations or discussions, and at least triggering some of that or sparking some of that interest in the next wave of people going into this field is very important. So I think that's one case where I see conflict. The second, like I said, one of my personal passions is thinking about technology for, developing or low resource environments, countries, regions. And oftentimes you'll see massive amounts of resources and technology being, poured into technology that's marginally improving quality of life in a developed country that could have significant impact in an up and coming developing economy. And so, pursuing personal projects, working on new solutions that maybe can have an impact in different parts of the world is usually how I try to mitigate that conflict. But, of course, thinking about, is this technology that I'm working on here gonna really drastically change humanity, or could I use that resource, that intellectual capacity, to have a solution that'll impact more people much more significantly in, a poor or low resource country? So those are the two conflicts. But again, I think outside of work, there are different ways to try to resolve those conflicts through personal projects and personal engagements.
All right. Yeah, and one reason why I asked that is because we have a couple questions in YouTube. One from Osman, and he's asking, actually, I'll ask Ajijula's second question first, because I think that'll lead to Osman's question better. But Ajijula is asking, what can go wrong in such technology, considering the chatbot? What can we do to prevent it? And then Osman's question, which he did ask first, and Ajijula was following up, but I think Osman's question would be a better follow-up in that order. So, what can go wrong in technology concerning the chatbot? What are some ways to prevent stuff like that?
Yeah, so I think in the specific case of the chatbot, I talked about the main issue there being what you call a data drift, which is, in machine learning, you have a model that's trained to perform some very narrow task. It can be, identifying cats in images, or classifying certain objects, or providing some analysis of the sentiment of text. So there are very narrow tasks that you're trying to accomplish. And with chatbots, you have models that are actively learning. So they're out in the wild, and as new data comes in, new data in the form of people's conversations with that chatbot, that data is used to train the model. So if you give it a bunch of data points on racist comments, then that model learns and becomes racist. You can think of machine learning or AI just the same way as, the human mind. So if a human mind is taught to think a certain way, then that becomes the permanent framework or the permanent way of thinking. Now, there are certain things you can do, which is actively monitor the new data that's being used to train the model to prevent that kind of data drift. So from the chatbot example, I talked about the pipeline. From the data collection and the model development and deployment stage, you want to make sure you're actively monitoring the data that's coming in and actively monitoring your deployed model or product, in this case, the chatbot, to make sure that it doesn't veer off into bad consequences. So hopefully that provides a little more clarity.
All right. And then Osman's question, which did come before Ajijula's, but I felt it would be better, is based on what you're saying, on a personal level, do you feel like AI will will allow us to unlock new levels of moralities?
Wow. New levels of morality. Well, I guess I would question what your definition of new levels of morality is. But at the end of the day, I think it's important to realize, at present, we've only achieved narrow AI. Like I mentioned, we have AI that's being used for very specific targeted tasks. You have AI that can, like I said, classify things or predict the weather next week, or provide chatbot assistance. So very narrow specific tasks. We have yet to reach the stage of AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, which is just how humans think. You can process anything in real time, and that's just what you refer to as general intelligence. But beyond the fact of general intelligence, machines don't have emotions. They lack morality. They lack souls, which are the very things that differentiate technology or computers or machines from humans. Again, maybe in our lifetime, maybe in the next 100 years, there might be some new innovation that transforms this. But in the short term, there's still a lot more work to do just to even go from very narrow AI to general AI. And so I'm not sure if we'll necessarily see, morality or emotional intelligence being a part of AI and robots. But hopefully that's something, Usman, that you can help work on and help advance in the near future.
Yeah, and I would like to point out, if you believe in Will Smith and his character Del Spooner in iRobot, I think that movie's set in 2035, so it might not be 100 years, it might be 14 years.
Yeah.
But of course, I think, and we're not going to jump too deep into the movie, but I think it's fascinating how in the movie they present Isaac Asimov's three laws of robotics. I think three laws of robotics or three laws of AI, but there's a ranked priority of what each robot is allowed to do.
Mm-hmm.
They cannot supersede a certain law, and obviously, we see in the movie, things go awry for various reasons, and Will Smith is called in to save the day, thankfully. Mm-hmm. But of course, that is a futuristic setting. Regardless of the year, the idea is what could happen in the future, and that's an important question. How do you see tech and analytics impacting the future of the world?
Yeah, I think personally, I like to have a very optimistic view. Of course, I know based on the presentation I delivered earlier, I did highlight some of the pessimistic aspects of technology, but I think that's important to prevent further pessimism or further consequences. But I think with data and technology and analytics, there's a lot of great potential. We're already seeing a lot of value add, being able to connect people, around the world. Things that may not have been possible in the past decade are now, very highly transformed as a result of things like social media or breakthroughs in healthcare. So we're seeing a lot of the positive impact that technology can have in making quality of life better, access to education more equitable, financial sort of resources being equally distributed and accessible to all. So there are a lot of valuable positives that we see in technology. But again, I think the best way to predict the future is to create it yourself. And so I think, creators of Facebook or creators of now Meta or Twitter took that into their own hands and were responsible enough to create technology that now is dictating the way we interact and engage with each other. And this isn't just exclusive to Facebook or Twitter. These are just brand names that I'm referencing, but you can think about any modern day technology that you're using. There was an individual or group of individuals who pioneered that effort. And so I think my view of technology in the future is very optimistic. I think there's a lot of potential, but I think, again, the job's not done, and I think there's a lot more that we can do. And so hopefully this group here has taken away some motivation to be able to create the future.
Yeah, definitely. We do have another quick question coming in from YouTube from Abhinav Singh. Can the AI specific instructions be changed, or say, can it unlearn something if we find out that AI is going the wrong way because of the data drift you mentioned? And before you answer that, I'd like to throw in, that is kind of what happened in the movie, or both things that Abhinav mentioned. I don't want to spoil it for anyone. I think it's a great movie. It's been out for a long time, but I do think it's great for anyone to watch if they haven't seen it. But I would say short answer, yes. AI specific instructions can be changed with coding, and it's just like a human person being taught, they like the color red, now they like the color blue, and then unlearning something, I guess, is kind of the same thing. I can unlearn running a red light when I'm driving, for example. But obviously, Bruke, want to make sure we get your perspective as well.
Yeah, no, I think you captured it well. There are obviously, the traditional ways of, how can you tune your existing model? How can you provide, new data or additional data that, that trains the model to improve performance on some certain access. But there are also specific areas of machine learning, such as reinforcement learning, which is how can you provide agents some reward to perform some action. So you think about training a dog to perform some trick, you provide some reward to train and ultimately get that dog or puppy or whatever it might be to perform that action, so that now in the mind of that puppy, they associate a positive reward whenever they perform that trick, or a negative reward whenever they do something wrong. And so there are a lot of up and coming areas within machine learning research that are looking to do that. I encourage you, Abhinav, to look at reinforcement learning, which is a very interesting approach to how can you incentivize the learning of certain things and decentivize the learning of others.
All right, and then last question, all the stuff that we've talked about, who you are as a person, who you are professionally, all the different things. This is a bit of a vague question, but it depends on how you define this. Your community. What would you hope to see for your community? And of course, what does community mean to you? Geographically, or is it a group of people, or people with a certain interest? What is it?
Yeah, I think for me, at the end of the day, especially whenever I'm wearing my hat as a technologist, I hate to say this, but the world is the community. You shouldn't necessarily be optimizing for a certain group or a certain population with interest, because then that's how you end up in cases where, the technology that you're producing is disproportionately impacting other groups that are not part of that population. And so, of course, I have personal groups or personal communities that I have closer affinity with. Like I said, I do hope to see more investments in technology for developing nations. So, the country I come from, Ethiopia, I would love to see greater breakthroughs in fintech or ed tech or health tech, because I do think that the slightest investment in technology could have large efficiency gains and productivity gains and overall quality of life gains. So, I personally do want to see, larger investments in other parts of the world. And I do hope to see technology playing a big role in transforming and providing global development and economic development for different regions in the world. But for people like me who've had similar stories, similar backgrounds, went to public school systems, maybe had challenges academically, professionally, may not have the best environment, whatever it might be. Realizing that there are mentors, there are committed organizations, there are opportunities that are out there to really excel your personal passions and careers. So for me, the role of mentors has played a big role in getting to where I am. The role of opportunities in the form of internships or research opportunities or summer programs that I was able to be involved in. So all those things, are a big part of unlocking opportunity. So for my community, I do want to see the future generation of technologists actively seek those things, but also for these resources to be readily available. And I think this hackathon is a prime example of the great opportunities that it can unlock in terms of connecting people, exposing people to new concepts, and hopefully bridging connections that can lead to good career opportunities in the future. So long-winded answer, but I hope for nothing but a positive, optimistic role of technology for my community.
Yeah, definitely. I like to point out, the fear of technology, it's not that we're stupid or we just don't get it. It's, we are concerned about the downsides, but, I would say for the past several thousand years and more, from finding fire or discovering fire, or I guess finding out how to use fire and all that to having the internet, I think, mostly we've been pretty good as a species in harnessing it properly. Before I did say last question, but we do have two more from students from Texas Southern University. Everyone can see Lisa Eze in the chat there. She is the student president for TSUCS, the Comp Sci Club here for Texas Southern University. And she asked, so she said, you mentioned the importance of diversity of thought in AI. From your experience at Microsoft, are you noticing this happening? And is your company and or others actively working to diversify their teams?
Yeah, so for me, I think, specifically speaking with Microsoft, I think it's, a company that I was able to find great support systems for different communities that I'm a part of. So there's, employee resource groups that you can engage with, whether it be, based on your race, your gender, your personal interest. So there's a community for everyone within the company. I think generally realizing some of the importance of diversity and inclusion for like overall business value as well. We're seeing a lot of companies actively, prioritize recruitment and hiring of diverse talent. And I think beyond just diversity, I think inclusion is the most important part. So there's the famous saying, I think it's diversity is getting invited to the party and inclusion is being asked to dance or something along those lines. But I think that's a prime example of you're not just a number or a statistic for this company to say they have this number of X individuals, but rather your contributions are being actively valued and listened to. And I think for me, being a company and a team within Microsoft, I feel that my contributions are valued. I feel that my perspectives are valued. And so that's a big part of what's motivated me to be in this industry, to be in this company. But that's not to say there aren't opportunities for improvement. Across the industry, across the company, there's always further opportunities for improvement. And that's something I'm very optimistic about and I'm seeing good progress on.
All right. And the last question, we do want to make sure that you get to enjoy your weekend. From Ian, also a Texas Southern University student. Since we train behavior and work for AI, is there a possibility that the trained object could develop a mind of its own?
Well, again, it depends on what a mind in your perspective means. If a mind is the ability to go off and make those decisions by itself, then yes, that is what AI is doing. You train it on a bunch of data to identify patterns. In the simplest terms, that's what it is. You have a bunch of data, you train a model, you say, a cat is something that looks like this, a dog is something that looks like this. And then for new examples, that model is now being able to use its previous experiences with all the data that it's seen to look at a new image and say, now I know that that is a cat. Now I know that that is a dog. So to some extent, yes, current approaches with supervised and unsupervised learning are providing the ability for technology to go off and do these very narrow tasks with a mind of its own. Of course, it's not at perfect accuracy, but for many tasks, we see it performing much better than even humans. So to some extent, yes, it is performing with a mind of its own on those specific tasks. But like I said, there's still not elements of emotion, of reasoning, of context switching. So if you're driving or in a self-driving car and the decision on whether or not to kill a puppy or slam into the wall, as a human, there are a lot of factors that maybe you're considering. But from a technology point of view, there's no reasoning, there's no emotion. So there's certain limitations that maybe don't make it a mind of its own per se, but in terms of actually executing day-to-day tasks, yes, these machines or these systems are actively, engaging without human supervision.
All right. Well, Brooke, thank you so much. Thank you, obviously, to Dr. Gimri and Lisa Eze from Texas Southern University, one of the largest HBCUs in the United States and based here in Houston. And then thank you, Richmond Isabor in Dallas with Southern Methodist University. And obviously, welcome to everyone else watching from wherever you are, whether it's today or later. We hope that this has been a great experience for you. You can check in the video description below. We will have contact information for Brooke, so feel free to talk to him. And of course, Brooke, thank you so much for taking time out of your Saturday. We understand it's not quite as warm and sunny up there for you, but nevertheless, we do appreciate you doing this outside of your usual schedule time, and especially on pretty short notice. Really appreciate having you here. Look forward to bringing you back for more talks. We look forward to continuing the stuff we're doing through this hackathon. Also, this concept of having an online talk and broadcasting it to multiple on-site locations. We would love to do this for more HBCUs, HBCU students, anyone who's underserved, overlooked, underprivileged, other countries. We definitely hope to do that. And obviously, anyone with questions about AI. If you can't watch iRobot, feel free to reach out to Brooke. I would say my impression is he probably would be the guy who saves us from the robots. So we would not need Will Smith. Apologies to Mr. Smith, but Brooke, thank you so much. It was great having you. Any closing words?
Again, thanks so much for having me, Scotty. Like I said, best way to predict the future is to create it yourself. So hopefully, you're able to walk away, to everyone tuning into this talk. You're able to walk away with some valuable insights from today's session, but also, the motivation, the excitement, the passion to go forth and be great. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to many, many, many more future interactions with you all.
All right, thank you, Brooke. Yeah, coming in from Microsoft, AI Product Manager. Everyone check below for contact information, and we will see you around.
All righty. Thanks so much, Scotty.
Thanks a lot, Brooke. Take it easy.